Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal, but be ardent in spirit and serve God. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. And if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Gareth, on this St. Patrick's Day, we hear you gladly.
We were almost loving each other with mutual affliction. Which sounded like one of those things that's maybe more true than So, somebody said to me once that the second worst thing you can do with power is to use it for evil ends. But the worst thing you can do with power is to pretend that you don't have it at all.
Well, I get it.
Because you'll end up unconsciously wreaking havoc. And all of us, I believe, as humans, have power of some kind. And another word for power, a nicer word for power, can be gift. Each of us has received something, and the gift is often related to our wounds. And maybe the task of the conscious life is to transform the wound from a wound into a scar. And along the way, I think, frankly, that never happens without using the place where you suffer as the place where you give. So, we're going to start a little bit differently. I'm going to invite you to have brief conversations with each other that we're going to model in a moment. And I also know that some people really don't like to have brief conversations with each other because that's not your gift right now. So if it is 51% or more life-giving to have a conversation, I invite you to step into it. And if it's 51% or more life-giving to not participate in the conversation, I invite you to just be present and hold space for those of us who are talking. Either is totally welcome, and it won't take long. This is a conversation about what your gift is, and I have 3 willing volunteers about whom I know very little who are going to answer first of all. Tyrone, what is your gift? One sentence, please. What is your gift?
I believe my gift is I bring peace and healing to the community.
Amen. And Brian, what is your gift?
I nurture the sacred and other folk, mostly by sitting with them in the messy places.
Sitting with them in the messy places. Thank you. And Karen, what is your gift?
I have tea with my friends and I take naps.
Long, rejuvenating naps. And the tea that Karen has with her friends creates a space of connection and welcome and healing. And the reason these 3, not just because I know them really well, the reason I wanted those 3 examples is sometimes when we ask a question like, what is your gift? We feel like it has to be really highfalutin and have letters after its name. But it doesn't. So, here's the invitation. For those of you who find it life-giving to participate, turn to the person next to you, and this is going to have to be done really quickly, because I have a 2.5-hour long sermon to preach, and I want to condense it into no more than 2 hours and 25 minutes. Okay, so So turn to the person next to you and very quietly, because you still need to hear my voice, decide who is person one. Make that decision right now. Who is person one? And this needs to be in groups of two. It can't be more than two people. So okay, who is person one? Raise your hand if you're person one. Okay, and then the other person is person A. No hierarchies here. Person one and person A. Person one, ask this question. Person A, respond, and you have 30 seconds to respond. It doesn't need to go long and complicated. Person one, please ask this question. Say, person A, what is your gift?
What's your gift?
And switch. Person A asks the question of person one. What is your gift?
I think it's also a kind of way to translate, not just words, but one group to another, one constituency to another, staff to faculty staff, members to non-members. It's a way of translating words and realities in one.
And it's time for another question. Switch roles, and the second question is, what's an example of how I have used this gift in the last year?
I'll start. You may know the faculty chair at Marc, and that has been mostly long listening session. After I listen, I then talk to various leaders.
And time to switch again. The same question. What's an example of how I've used this gift in the last year? And time for the third of 4 questions. We're halfway done. Question 3. What blocks your gift? What blocks your gift?
Key. Feeling that I'm not good enough. Forgetting that good.
And switch the respondent around. Same question. What blocks your gift? And the last question. I invite you to take a good, long breath. And to look at your partner in this dialogue. Person 1, go first with this. The gift I see in you is.
Maybe teach others how
And switching partners for the last time, the gift I see in you is.
I think this person like arrives in things and it doesn't feel like the burden on you that
Thanks, everybody. If there's something that seems life-giving to you about that dialogue, think about it beyond today. And if there's something that seems kind of weird and totally off base, don't think about it beyond today. This talk is called St. Patrick, Bayard, Rustin, and Us. Who has heard of Us? Not too many. That's kind of strange. Who has heard the name St. Patrick before? And please put your hand really high if you've heard the name Bayard Rustin before.
Amen.
This is one of the things that marks Circle of Mercy out from pretty much any other context that I've ever spoken. I've never had more than 2 people in an audience know the name Bayard Rustin. That's great, because it's an opportunity to introduce him to people, because I think he has something to say to us. But we'll start with St. Patrick. It's St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March. We actually don't know a lot about St. Patrick. I'm sorry to say there were no snakes. He didn't cast them out of Ireland. Although there is a good Irish joke about that, which is, what did St. Patrick say to the snakes when he was driving them out of Ireland?
Yeah.
Are you all right there in the back? There was no green beer, and we actually don't have a whole lot to go on other than a couple of his own written documents. But here's something we do know. He was not Irish. He was Welsh, like Tom Jones. Unlike Tom Jones, he was brought to Ireland in chains, enslaved there as a teenager, escaped, got back home, and then did something extraordinary. He turned back and went to the place of the enemy. One could imagine that he had not the most pleasant memories of Ireland. We could imagine that he might even have been what we would now call traumatized by his experience there. But something had so captured his heart that it compelled him to go back to these people who he'd only known in chains together. Now, that sentence alone, something had compelled him to go back to these people. What's the word that jumps out at you from that sentence? Something had compelled him to go back to these people. What do you think is the most important word in that sentence? Compelled sounds like a good one, right? But to me, it's not the most important word.
People.
People. Patrick went back to Ireland at a time when the rest of what would have been called then the known world, but that's kind of weird because there were other parts of the world that would have had their own versions of the known world too, but the world known in Europe, the world known in Europe did not consider Irish people to be people. Irish were considered to be barbarian at best, primitive, less than, something that you would enslave. Not worthy of something like good religion, good news, the teaching and meaning of Jesus. To decide to tell Irish people that they were loved by God, and that Christ, which is not Jesus' last name, but a word that describes imperfectly the everythingness of love, to tell Irish that we deserved to hear this. Frankly, he didn't even have to say anything after that. The work was already done.
Well,
there's a lovely story about a Belfast bishop who, during a cholera epidemic in about the 1850s in Belfast, 50,000 people, I believe, died from the cholera and were buried in unmarked graves. Now, you can't disturb ground where cholera victims have been buried for several centuries, because the cholera can still live in the ground. These people would have all been traditional Irish Catholics, and many of them would have died without having received the proper sacraments that within traditional Irish Catholicism many people would believe you need in order to get out of limbo and go to heaven. When this bishop died, he left word that a part of the unmarked graves on the corner of the land that wouldn't disturb the cholera would be reserved for him to be buried in. Because when you bury a bishop in the 1850s, people believe that it makes the land holy. And so it automatically releases those 50,000 people and brings comfort to their family. This is kind of what St. Patrick was doing for Irish people by saying, you matter enough for me to even come and tell you what I'm going to tell you. Now, the bonus is that what he told people was pretty good as well, which is that everything has been saved and is being saved and is going to be saved, and the pathway to experience embodiment of this salvation is simply to devote yourself to love of God, neighbour, and self. Patrick had every reason not to go back to Ireland. Nobody would have blamed him. In fact, it might, I don't even know, but it might have been physically dangerous. You know, can you imagine escaping from a prison and then deciding, I really like the people in that prison, I'm going to give them something, and then sneaking back into the prison. So I feel like while there's endless conversation to be had about the content of Patrick's message, that's for another day. It's the context that matters the most, which is that when he could have walked away, he turned back out of love, and he told me that I was worthy when everybody else was saying I was nothing. Which brings me to Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin, a Quaker from Pennsylvania, born in 1912, conscientious objector in the Second World War, and someone who we could also talk endlessly about, but because of our time limitations today, what I'll say is this. You could make the argument that Bayard Rustin mentored Dr. King in taking non-violence more deeply as a way of life. My understanding is the point at which they met, Dr. King was committed to non-violence as a political strategy. He believed it was the right thing to do as well, but it wasn't a full lifestyle, yet he had armed guards because he was under threat. And Dr. King's wife, Coretta, told him, I don't actually feel comfortable with there being weapons around, and Rustin was a generation older than Dr. King, and he mentored him in a deeper form of non-violence. He organized the March on Washington, which doesn't just include inviting the speakers, he arranged the buses. And there's a great footage of the film footage of the March on Washington when Bob Dylan and Joan Baez are performing. There's a man, a very distinguished looking man in a three-piece suit, walking behind them smoking a cigarette. And he looks a bit like Morgan Freeman, and that's Bayard Rustin. And I mean, he organized probably the most important public gathering in the 20th century. And the Duke historian Tim Tyson says he thinks that Bayard Rustin is the most fascinating figure of the 20th century. Not one of, but the most fascinating figure of the 20th century. He lived till 1987. He was 75 when he died, and he remained an activist. Why have you, people outside Circle of Mercy, never heard of him? I think it's because he was gay. And there was a conscious decision to keep him in the background. Why are we talking about him today? Well, today would be his 107th birthday. He was born on St. Patrick's Day. So in our household, we mark St. Patrick Rustin Day. And I think there's a big parallel between Patrick and Rustin beyond just their birthdays. Bayard Rustin, as a gay man and as a black man, nobody would have blamed him for going somewhere else. There were safer places to be, easier places to be. Even if he was only one of those beautiful things. And yet, he turned back. Not only to speak on behalf of and to the members of communities that would have identified with being a person of colour or being a person of the LGBTQ community, not only to tell us that we were worthy, but to tell even his enemies, there's a place for you here too. Just leave your harm at the door, and you can come with us. All you need to do is devote yourself to love God, to love your neighbor as yourself. I think Rustin and Patrick both had reason not only to stay where they were, but to wallow in despair, to live in the darkness. There's a line in a movie that I love from 1973 where an elderly priest and a younger priest are talking on a stairwell. The younger priest is in despair because something awful is happening to somebody very innocent. And he says to the older priest, "Why would such a thing be allowed to happen?" And the elderly priest says of Satan, "I think the point is to make us despair. To believe that if such a thing could happen to one whom we know to be innocent, how much worse do those of us who know we are not innocent, how much worse do we deserve?" And I think this may be one of the greatest dangers facing us in this moment in time. When, no matter what day of the week, you can find something awful to feel despair about. You can. They're all real. But we owe it to ourselves and to truth itself, which, if it sets us free, is an important calling. We owe it to ourselves to be thinking about context and proportion as much as we think about empathy over the one awful thing we're thinking about right now. This is a replica of Vincent van Gogh's famous chair. It was painted by one of my favorite people. His name is Pete Magendie. And with his wife Joyce, he pastors a ramshackle community of people who have experienced the light and the darkness in their heights and their depths. Pete himself has struggled greatly with severe depression for much of his life. He makes his living as a house painter, but as you can see, he's also a great painter of other things. Several years ago, in the city where they live, a natural disaster occurred, and nearly 200 people died. And Pete and Joyce were leaders of the lament and grief work that needed to be done. And they have established one of the most holy, and by holy I mean psychologically integrated and everything else, memorials I've ever seen in a natural disaster. The city they're from is Christchurch in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And Pete painted this and brought it here to Asheville 18 months ago to use at a conference at Montreat called Radical Beauty. And his point was, if you close part of your mind, all you'll see is the darkness. If you close the other part of your mind, you might kind of be detached from reality. But if you're only facing the worst things that are happening in the world, you're not actually living in reality.
That's right.
And if you're only facing the best things that are happening in the world, I understand why. Sometimes we need more light just to get us through. But you're not living in reality. This is reality. Even better, the light is in 3 dimensions. There is light at the end of the tunnel. This is Pete's gift to us. I was in touch with Joyce yesterday. It was their 45th wedding anniversary on Friday.
Wow.
And they had a subdued celebration with their friends. And what I want to offer in closing is, Pete and Joyce don't want us to despair for Christchurch. They want us to lament and to grieve and to leave them alone to the degree that us interfering could hurt them or make their lives more difficult, and to support them best by loving our Muslim neighbours here in Asheville and by devoting ourselves to the truth that the light and the darkness coexist, and the darkness will never overcome the light. And each of us has a dual invitation in the light of the life of St. Patrick and Bayard Rustin. Part of it is to ask ourselves, where are we invited to turn back? And to whom? And part of it, maybe the starting part, is to look at the places within that we find unlovable and to turn back to those places too. So we're a community here at Circle of Mercy that has been a great source of healing to me. And I want to invite you that if you want a friend on the journey toward loving yourself better, that's not an act of selfishness. It's actually 1/3 of the greatest commandment. I'll be your friend. I know you'll be mine. If you want some help to think, to whom are you called to turn back? Let's talk about that with each other in the days and weeks to come. And know that there are people on the other side of the world dealing with an immense tragedy at the moment. But they're dealing with it the way we would too. And they love us, and we send our love to them. And they invite us to become best friends with our own souls. On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may they play dance to balance you. And when your eyes freeze behind the grey window and the ghost of loss gets into you, may a flock of colours, gold, red, indigo, and azure blue, come to awaken in you a meadow of delight. When the canvas frays in the current of thought and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you, may there come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to guide you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours. May the protection of the ancestors, including Patrick and Bayard Rustin, be yours. May the fluency of the ocean be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words of love around your heart, an invisible cloak to mind your life. Amen.
Amen.